Awesome. Thank you so much for having me too. It's an honor to be here, and I love the work that you do. So it's really, really amazing to be able to connect in this way. So yeah, as Erica mentioned, I'm the Climate Justice Policy Coordinator for Climate Action Campaign. We're a nonprofit based in San Diego, and we're branching out a little bit into Orange County, but we do work all over San Diego. And we focus on what we call the 5 fights. And so that's climate action oriented around ensuring safe and livable neighborhoods for everyone, to ensure that we're building a safe and resilient future, and particularly advocating and uplifting those who have traditionally been left out or excluded. So also currently we're working with the county on their what they call their regional decarbonization framework, which is their efforts to lower the carbon emissions throughout the San Diego region. And so what I do primarily is a lot of community outreach and mobilizing around climate action, and really, again, ensuring that the voices are uplifted and heard, and getting that feedback to the county so that when policies are made, they're community driven and informed and equitable. And I guess I should say that's our mission is to do climate action through effective and equitable policy action. So that's our main approach. And then a little bit about me. So my background is in performing arts and climate action and ocean conservation. So I went to USD and double majored in marine science and theater, and then for undergraduate. And then I went and joined the circus, as you do after that. So I worked as a performing artist for about 10 years in the immersive industry, doing lots of interactive performing, acting, dance, production coordinating, all those sorts of things. And then I also did a lot of ocean conservation and coral reef work. And then a couple of years ago, I decided that it was time to do to go back to school. So I went to grad school at Scripps Institution of Oceanography at UCSD and got my master's in marine biodiversity and conservation. And that was really to focus on what I initially had started, and use the performing arts as a platform to connect communities to ocean conservation and climate action. And so, as an example, I produced a show last year at the Birch Aquarium focusing on how climate change impacts coral reefs. And the story was told through dance and theater and interactive participation in an immersive environment. And that's really what led me to doing climate action work, because the more that I've studied coral reefs and really been dedicated to coral reef conservation, the more I realize that the best thing that we can do for coral reefs is tackle climate change, because that is their number one threat. And the more that we can lower the rate of change, and the more that we can give them time to adapt, because unless they have that time, the warming waters, that's going to be their biggest issue. So yeah, in a sort of a short story, or long story short, it's my connection and love and passion for wanting to do coral reef conservation that led me to identifying Climate Action Campaign and doing the work here locally that will have global impact.
That's awesome. Thanks for sharing. I actually did research in undergrad on coral reefs too. We were investigating which genes are responsible for the algae and coral like symbiosis, and which genes are affected where coral bleaching happens, like why the algae fall off and what genes are responsible for that. So our
Oh my gosh, that's amazing. We'll definitely have to chat more about that.
I know, I love the coral reefs. Okay, we'll just move along to Karen. If you could talk about yourself and Hammond Climate Solutions Foundation. I know you guys do so much. So I was just telling Martin, I was looking through the website, and I was like, they do so much. I couldn't even talk about this if I wanted, like, so I just need you to give a little spiel about what you guys do.
Right. Yeah. Hi, everyone. My name is Karen. I am the Climate Justice Policy Intern for Hammond Climate Solutions Foundation. I guess just a very basic explanation is that of what we do is that we help nonprofits and local organizations across the country essentially afford the switch to solar energy. But as the policy intern, I'm also helping to keep track of local clean energy legislation, working to expand the San Diego fossil fuel free pledge, which is essentially a tool for the public to know which philanthropic organizations, elected officials, or other community organizations have pledged to not take any donations um, from gas and electric companies. And currently I am studying environmental science and geography at UCLA. I got into the climate change and equity scene starting in high school when I was initially invited to participate in a march downtown by a good family friend. And, you know, before I had heard and kind of knew about climate change, but when I went downtown, that really changed everything because you just see the passion that so many people have about this topic, and they are all willing to gather and show that support. And so immediately I jumped on the opportunity to volunteer and organize my high school's climate walkout. I've also volunteered with my university's CalPERG organization. And now I'm here volunteering with Hammond Climate Solutions Foundation. And yeah, like you said, Erica, there's a lot that goes on, and I'm just so grateful to be a part of the team with them.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing. And then I would love to talk to Dr. Barreras about more so why. So I read a little bit about your background growing up in San Diego, and I would love for you to share why you feel that you have a role with climate justice as a physician, as an ER physician, and how you've seen it affect your patients and why you do the work that you do.
Yeah, sure. So I'm Dr. Elizabeth Barreras-Rivest. I grew up here in San Diego. I went on escapades elsewhere, doing degrees elsewhere, and then ended up coming home because San Diego is a beautiful place. The climate policy and advocacy really fell into my lap when I was a resident in emergency medicine here in San Diego. I met another physician who was trying to, get physicians all fired up about working in advocacy because we have a loud voice. We have a meaningful voice in the community, and healthcare contributes in a very large way to climate change. And not a lot of people really understand that. It's just one of those kind of really evil, unseen side effects of a really robust healthcare system. And so that always kind of eats away at you a little bit. I'm helping people, but I'm killing the planet. And so that's something obviously that we don't want to do as healthcare providers, because then it turns around on your patients and they are really affected by climate change. And the most vulnerable people are affected by climate change. And so I really became very passionate about trying to advocate more for better policies here in San Diego. San Diego is very climate forward. We have a lot of really good policy that is working toward, eliminating gas in households and electrifying everything and having really robust solar power. However, it's not enough because we have so much to catch up on. And really the climate justice issue comes in because in the emergency department, we see people at their very lowest point. We see people on their worst day, for health reasons, but also for social reasons. And currently I'm working at the VA here in San Diego, and a third of all homeless people are veterans. And so we are constantly seeing repeat patients who are coming in for social reasons, not necessarily for healthcare. It's because we're a warm place on a very cold night. And, we have food, and it's a place to go that people know when they don't really have anywhere else to go. So just by de facto being an emergency medicine physician, all of those things kind of come together, and it's my obligation and pleasure to help this population.
Thank you for sharing. I think that's actually a really good segue into our first question. I feel like when you talk about homelessness, climate change is not always the first thing you talk about. Usually we're talking about the housing policies or the a criminal justice system or foster care, not so much climate change. So in your own words, what is the relevance between climate change and its intersection with homelessness in urban cities like San Diego?
It plays a big role all winter long. I mean, this winter was wretched, just cold and rainy and miserable, even for people who are housed because they were afraid to turn their heaters on because it's so expensive. And then you get people who are out in the rain or, in their tent that inevitably is going to become waterlogged. And they, show up in my hospital in the emergency department because they're freezing and they already are depressed. A lot of our unhoused population has mental health issues on top of everything else. And so climate emergencies and climate change affects mental health issues. And so you just see a vast uptick in visitors, unhoused visitors to the emergency department in extreme climates. And I definitely saw that change this winter. You see it over the summer too when it's too hot because they also the same problem. There's nowhere to go. They don't know what else to do. And so there's a very big problem that is looming that we're kind of the canary in the coal mine as the emergency department because that's the first place people go. And so we're seeing it constantly, but they often don't have a voice and don't know who to talk to. And often people don't listen. So it's our job to advocate.
Absolutely. When those climate emergencies do happen, like the extreme heat waves, or if we have those wildfires or the extreme cold weather like we had in the winter, what does displacement look like for unhoused individuals? Like what resources do they have? And are there any plans available for them?
Coming from the emergency department, you mean?
Oh, this is for everyone, just for everyone on the panel.
Oh, okay.
Yes. Allie or Karen, if you would like to jump in.
I mean, I can just start us off just as a general overview, displacement obviously looks different depending on the specific natural disaster, but especially with unhoused individuals who already have such limited resources, those resources then become even harder to come by because now government entities have to divide it amongst the general public who is also, affected. And on top of that, they lose their belongings, as Dr. Barreras-Rivest said, and their health is at a higher risk than before with that. And in California, the thing that you hear most about is the wildfires, which significantly worsens the air quality. And with people who don't have a shelter to go to, like a home, they are at risk of inhaling that smoke and particulate matter that's released, which can develop and trigger respiratory illnesses like asthma. And flooding is something that is very relevant right now, because I understand that in San Diego, a big place that some people will go to set up camp is in riverbeds, which will be the first place to flood when we have severe rainstorms. And I know that organizations like the San Diego River Park Foundation are working to warn these individuals ahead of time when they need to prepare for the wet season, but it's not a permanent solution. And beyond this, we see intense wind, snow, mudslide events, which also impact the unhoused community first and worst. And of course, it all ties back to climate change because it's all intensified by the emissions of fossil fuels.
Yeah, and I can add to that too, in the sense that I like to think of climate change as an amplifier. And because what it does is it compounds on all of the cracks that already exist in the systems. And so when we have populations who are vulnerable to certain things because of economic inequities and disparities, they are going to be disproportionately impacted by the changes that are happening. So when there are extreme weather events that are creating things like flooding that might destroy a house, or wildfires that can completely burn down a house, or even the snow this past year, and some of the houses actually, the roofs were caving in because they couldn't handle the snowpack was so high. So the climate change extreme weather events manifest themselves differently, and we're experiencing the very beginning of that. It's the very tip of the iceberg of what's likely to come. And as part of our like outreach and understanding and learning more about what communities are experiencing firsthand, as an example, some of the communities out east in the backcountry have gotten used to preparing these to-go emergency kits, knowing that they may have to flee their houses at any given moment's notice because of the wildfires. And for some people, they mean if they lose their house, then that means they automatically become homeless. And for those who don't have the wealth to just, stay in an Airbnb or hotel, or don't have the family support or something like that, then they end up on the streets. And at the same time, like you're saying, Karen, for the unhoused populations who are experiencing the air pollution impacts firsthand, or the extreme cold events or relatively extreme cold events, then they're going to be impacted even more. And as these issues get worsened as time goes on, and as the climate changes get more severe, then it's only going to get more intense.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. My next question was just to kind of wrap up like the scope of this issue. How will unmitigated climate change affect our unhoused population, or just the vulnerable communities in general, in their day-to-day lives? Aside from like those natural disasters and extreme weathers and the floodings, what does everyday look like if we don't take care of the climate crisis? It's a hard one because I don't think it's going to look pretty, but
Well, for one, I could say it's going to get more expensive, especially because as we're seeing the rates of gas, for example, and often it's the low-income communities that have the gas appliances because they don't have the money to switch to all electric appliances. And so they're getting kind of the worst end of the deal. They're getting increased asthma rates and exposure to air pollutants already from the gas appliances, but then now without government assistance in terms of rebates or economic assistance like that, then suddenly they're going to have to pay even higher SDG&E bills, for example. And so this can lead to forcing people on the streets. And then, yeah, in terms of the day-to-day, there's a lot of uncertainty. So from a climate science perspective, we're pretty confident that in general, the trends are going to be hotter. So, and I should say the trends are going to get more extreme. So the hot heat spell events are going to get hotter. The dry spells are going to get drier. The wet spells are going to get wetter. And it's connected to variability and these oscillations in climate patterns that happen every so many years. So for example, the El Nino oscillation pattern happens about every 5 to 6 years. We're finding that during El Nino events, it's probably going to get really a lot more intense in terms of the drought and the heat waves. And then right now, for example, we're finishing up a La Nina. So it oscillates between an El Nino and La Nina every so many years. And so during the La Nina events, we're likely to see more wet conditions. And as we've seen, that can lead to extreme floods and things that we may not have been able to predict. And as an example, I just heard a conversation from the Water Authority earlier this morning, and at the end of 2022, they were looking at the charts of, so what is this next year going to look like? Is it going to be, are we going to get a lot of water? Are we going to be in a drought? It's really hard to know. So we can guesstimate as much as we can, but it's still kind of up in the air. And it turned out that this year we had a lot of water, which was a reprieve for our drought conditions, but it brought in other considerations like the extreme snow and extreme cold in certain areas. So yeah, uncertainty.
Climate change is like throwing a wrench for these climate scientists that thought they could predict these things. You talked a little bit about the expensive electrifying is very expensive. And I think I see that a lot with renewable energy, like solar panels can be very expensive, electric vehicles. Um, so how can, I guess my question is like, what, how is affordable housing going to happen when it seems to be expensive?
I can take a lead on this. Yeah, so definitely it is getting expensive. And in regards to affordable housing, there are efforts and legislation that are currently being reviewed right now. But one program that addresses exactly that is California's Solar on Multifamily Affordable Housing, or SOMA, the SOMA program. And yeah, it addresses exactly that for tenants or property owners or contractors. You know, it you seek out like funding ways to essentially provide financial incentives. Sorry, yes, the incentives to install these solar panels so that it becomes more widely accessible, and it would mostly benefit low income tenants and those property owners, so that it is just more common to live with solar panels, and it's not just something reserved for the people that can afford it, because the people that can afford it, they will, but it's the people who can't that we all need to focus on.
Yeah, and I can add to that too. And there are a lot of rebate programs and these sorts of things that are popping up more and more. So, for example, there's heat pump opportunities that people can participate in. There's something called the inclusionary housing ordinance, and here I can put this in the chat so there's more, you can learn more about it. But essentially what that does is ensure that there's protections for renters, so that so landlords can't just raise the rents into infinity and kick people out for no reason. So what this inclusionary housing ordinance does is ensure that there is like mixed income neighborhood, so it doesn't just become like just a purely wealthy neighborhood and kick everyone else out. And also ensure that there needs to be some percentage of housing in the locations to make sure that it's affordable, and creating those protections. There's also something called the Tenant Protection Ordinance that actually was just passed yesterday. So this was passed by the City Council of San Diego, and what this does is also include some protections for tenants. So meaning that they can't just raise rents for no reason, or I should say they can't evict their tenants for no reason. And if they are raising rents, then they need to do it in a way that is in line with like a slow step process. So these sorts of things are these policy decisions with housing are so connected and integral to preventing homelessness, and it is absolutely connected to climate change, because as climate change makes everything more expensive, then landlords are going to be tempted to raise the rents, and that just it just exacerbates the problems of inequity that we're facing.
Yeah, totally. I think that link of just things are more expensive and inequitable is very relevant to this conversation. My next question, I wanted to kind of get a, like, I don't want to say like an insider look, but Dr. Barreras-Rivest, as an ER physician, when you were talking about the patients coming in more so for social reasons because it was warm in the ER and because you guys had food and a bed, what does discharge look like? Like at what point do you decide like it's time to go, but like I know it's still hot out there, I know it's still cold out there. if you could talk a little bit more about that, and if there's any resources that the unhoused population do get like referred to.
Yes. So that is it's a very complicated question, and it's very patient dependent. So yes, there are resources. We have an ED social worker in the emergency department who is available most times, usually not in the middle of the night. And so when it's clear as to the reasons why these patients are coming to us, when they're medically cleared and there's no acute medical issue to address, then, we wait for the social worker to come, and we, like, here's your sandwich, here's your box of milk. As long as things aren't too crazy, we're happy to take our time. Because that's the kind thing to do. And then we have our social worker provide resources, basically saying, here's a list of housing options that you can call, a list of shelters, essentially. And usually they can be quite far away, or if discharge is going to be around, 10 p.m., their workup's done, we don't really have space to keep people overnight. We like to say we're not a hotel, but we do what we can. Then we often will get a taxi or some other sort of transportation service to get these unhoused individuals to a shelter before closing time or what have you. And so it really depends on time of day. It depends on the circumstances. It depends on if they're disabled. If they're in a wheelchair, then transport is significantly different than someone who can walk out on their own 2 feet. And so, yes, there are resources. Are they enough? No, because oftentimes we'll see people come back a couple of days later because, again, they wound up on the bus to somewhere that was far away from the shelter, or the shelter ran out of beds, or, their bed got given up, or what have you. So it depends on the individual, but yes, there are resources, but no, they are not enough.
Thank you for that. That totally makes sense. It's very situational. There's a question in the chat for you.
Mm-hmm.
It says, can you expand more on how the healthcare system contributes to carbon emissions and pollution and climate change as a whole?
Yeah, sure. So hospitals use a lot of energy, and so that in itself contributes to carbon emissions, and often it's dirty energy. There are a lot of systems that have started attempting to go all electric. Kaiser has been on the forefront of all of that, especially. I think Sharp recently committed to going all electric as well. But in general, hospitals are big users of dirty energy. In addition, there's things like the food that hospitals use. A lot of hospitals don't compost or have ways to prevent the methane emissions that come from thrown away food. And, there's a lot of thrown away food that comes out of a hospital system. There's a lot of anesthetic gases that contribute to emissions and the greenhouse effect tenfold more than methane or carbon. And so there's a lot of these really silent contributors that we don't necessarily see or talk about. But I think healthcare at this point contributes 15% of all carbon emissions to climate change. So it is a very big contributor, and it's a very big problem.
Do you have any insight on, like, are hospitals, like, are the higher ups like aware, like, is this kind of on their forefront? Are they doing anything about it, or what? You were talking about those physicians that all are passionate about climate advocacy. How do the healthcare systems respond to that?
There are a lot of physicians who have very loud voices, especially over the last couple of years, who are really coming out and saying this very obviously affects our patients. It affects the work that we do. It affects our communities. And it's a very big public health crisis. And so physicians are aware, systems are aware. There's a lot of, as with any system, any large system, it's a very slow process to make change. But yes, I would say, especially here in San Diego, just from what I've seen, a lot of systems are very aware of this issue and how it affects their bottom line. If you make it about if the finances have to be be the bottom line, which they often do in a lot of situations, unfortunately, yes, it affects the bottom line. You're seeing more people show up in the hospital, in the emergency room, and chronic conditions are exacerbated by the climate crisis. And so it's just they realize that it's a public health imperative, and it affects the businesses that they do. And it very much is on the docket for all of these hospital systems because it's such an impending issue. And with that, Erica, I'm sorry, I do have to step out, but thank you guys so much for having me. I have to run off to my shift, but thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Have a great shift.
Thank you
for being here. Next question, I think Dr. Barreras gave us a great segue into how everyone is aware of both of these issues, the climate crisis and the housing crisis, but I feel like there are challenges when we're talking to the public about this. So if Allie and Karen, if you could speak on the challenges that you see when you're talking about the climate crisis, or what are these challenges when it comes to advocacy?
Sure, definitely. I think at the end of the day, people are going to be most concerned with their immediate environmental surroundings. So whether that's finding food, supporting their families, just sometimes just surviving, making it day to day, those concerns are always going to be first and foremost. And sometimes they intersect with the climate crisis, like in the forefront of consciousness, and sometimes they don't. And so we do run into the issues occasionally of a lot of times like low-income communities or communities that do not have the financial resources in general, are not thinking about climate change because that's literally like the last thing on their mind when they're concerned about what are we going to eat tonight? How am I going to feed my children? And so part of our strategies are helping make those connections between how the climate crisis is a public health crisis, and helping people make those light bulb moment connections of seeing how these extreme weather impacts are the result of climate change. Because a lot of people actually don't necessarily make that connection, and our media does not do a very good job of spelling it out in that way. And then unfortunately, there's been so much polarization on the political side that any sort of climate change word has been so associated with, oh, that's a liberal thing, that's a Democrat thing. And so reaching communities who might be a little bit more like conservative leaning or things like that, you really have to kind of change the way you talk about it. And what we're finding is that framing it as a public health crisis it speaks to people more, because then they can start to understand, like, hey, do you notice it got really hot this year? Do you notice that, like, how did the floods impact you? Did you have did the fires make it harder to go outside and breathe, things like that. And those are the sorts of things that everybody can resonate with more directly. And I think in general, humans are pretty bad about long-term thinking. And so now that climate change really is here and making impacts day to day, people are starting to get the sense of, oh, this actually is a problem. So we're running out of time to really make large scale policy changes and implementation of infrastructure scale changes that we need to really decrease the carbon emissions to stabilize the climate enough to not get into these runaway situations where things will get much worse. So it's one day at a time, doing everything we can as fast as we can, really, while we have this small window of opportunity to create a better future. And that's also how we're framing things, is coming together as a community, working together to envision a brighter future, one that is rooted in resilience and holistic well-being and inclusionary and not leaving out any of our populations, but actually building a more loving world together. And that's how we do it, is through collaboration and through through hope and generating that sense of hope that yes, we can do this. There is a brighter future, and here's how. And here's how we have to work with the systems that we have and create that future that we all want to see.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead, Karen. I'm sorry.
No, I really love the way that Ali said that, because scientists and journalists have learned that a doomsday approach does not work when it comes to talking about this, because it does it can burn people out if people think that there's no hope, especially for the younger generation. You know, if they think that their future is set in stone by now, then they're not going to feel as motivated to make any changes or push for changes, because they think that it's all out of their hands. But you know, and like Ali said, we should treat this as a health crisis. But unfortunately, you know, sometimes we have to push our elected officials, which are political figures, to pass groundbreaking environmental legislation. And sometimes, like very recently, we took a step backwards with the Willow Project being passed. And that was after President Joe Biden campaigned that he would no longer dedicate public land to fossil fuel extraction. And so actions like that can have the public lose trust in public figures. But if we focus more on making it a community effort and emphasize that we can make change, then I think that is what's going to really help us set us on a more positive trajectory rather than just give up.
Thank you for that insight. Martin, you have a question?
Hi, I have a bit of a futuristic question. I know that the way we've been talking about climate change right now is about how it's very short term, and the most immediate things we need to be addressing is things like oil and non-renewable resources. But has there been any conversations at your organizations about urban planning? I grew up in San Diego, and I presume Los Angeles is similar, where it just doesn't feel like a functional city for public transportation. It feels, I presume there's a lot of carbon emissions that that go into development. I don't think development is very sustainable. And that all trickles down to contributing to people's pocketbooks in the sense where like they're paying more money to commute to work. They're paying more money for these more expensive buildings. Has there been any conversations about urban planning, making cities more sustainable and functional for like a future world? Yeah.
I'm so glad you asked that, because that is one of our focus areas. So I mentioned we have 5 fights that we kind of orient all of our work around. One of those 5 fights is creating bikeable, walkable neighborhoods. And that is very much connected to the urban planning side of things, in terms of expanding, like advocating for expansion of bike lanes and sidewalks, and planting more trees so that those pathways are cooler, they're not getting so hot, and they're safer, and those sorts of things. And then one of our other 5 fights is on ensuring world-class transit, meaning making the transit options more accessible. And this is very connected to our unhoused populations, because one of the biggest issues is having access to transit. I think Dr. Barreras-Rivest said that, you know, sometimes folks will be really far away from a homeless shelter, and if there's no bus line, there's no train line to get there, then they're kind of out of luck. And this is especially true for East County, North County, that's really far away. Geographically, those spaces are huge. There's really not very good transit options at all. It's very car-centric out there. And same with the indigenous reservations. There's not necessarily good access to transit that's interconnected. And so what we're advocating for is a cohesive network of public transportation that has to be done from a policy side of things, because it needs to be done by those who have the legal jurisdiction and authority and financial power to make it happen. So that means we're doing a lot of collaborative work with agencies like SANDAG, for example, and with all the local elected leaders, and calling for things like a regional, and the SANDAG's working on the regional transportation plan, for example. So we're advocating for very specific things in there to improve things like access to public transit. So yes, it's all very connected and part of the equation. And one more thing I'll say too is, in terms of urban planning, something that's really important to consider is this idea of sprawl. And while developers may be tempted to, develop houses that are far away, like outside on the edges of this urban areas and so on, it's actually not the best solution going forward, because what that does is it increases the reliance on cars if they're not done in connection to being next to railways or bus lines or whatever it is. And so that means that the more people that are living in these sprawling neighborhoods, then there's more cars, there's more carbon emissions, et cetera, et cetera. And so what part of our approach is to advocate for affordable housing in connection to public transit hubs. And so, for example, like Little Italy in San Diego is super walkable, it's easy to get everywhere. And those sorts of environments, we can advocate for affordable housing, or in the Midway neighborhood, for example, advocating for affordable housing there, and as long as it's done equitably. So ensuring that it is, again, next to these public transit hubs and not just contributing to all the other problems. So it is really interesting to see like all of these different intersections, of how addressing and tackling climate change and climate action really is connected to things like housing development and urban sprawl. And yeah.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I love the tie-in with like a walkable and bikeable city and how that affects, our homeless population as well. I think I just have two more questions about, again, the future, like what we can do as concerned citizens. So from your perspective and your experience with your organizations, what could we do to advocate for our planet and its unhoused neighbors? And what kind of policies are you there to, oh, sorry, my lights are motion censored and I'm sitting in one place. So let me start over. So what policies are needed to prevent the exacerbation of homelessness due to climate change? And then the second part is, what can we do as individual citizens, concerned citizens, to help our planet and its people, especially those vulnerable populations?
I guess I'll get us started on this question. It's a great question. And tying it back to something that Ali said earlier is that when people are concerned with things like how they're going to pay rent or how they're going to afford their next meal, they can't afford the time to passionately care about things like climate change or how it really connects to homelessness. And so by first promoting policies that would address homelessness and equity, we can uplift that community and for them to be able to advocate for climate justice. And then moving on to like policies that actually like promote clean energy, community solar policies that provide renters discounts and rebates on like making that switch to solar and getting a discount on their electric bills, that's huge. And it's actually coming soon. However, the maximum discount that people can actually get at the moment is 10%, but it could be 100% if we were to change a few things like increasing minimum wage, having affordable healthcare so that people don't have to go into debt to take care of themselves, and providing resources like free education or like free preschool and daycare so that parents who maybe, maybe they're the only ones who can provide for their children, they don't have to worry about having to split their time between their children and earning that money. And rent stabilization policies as well, so that people aren't priced out of their own homes just for wanting to install climate friendly projects and appliances. So really bold climate policies like that would help both prevent more individuals becoming unhoused, and also get the people who are unhoused off the streets. And then I guess what everyone can do as concerned citizens to advocate for the planet. As we've gone over, there is so many reasons why someone would become unhoused. And so we need to address those things. So mental health services, additional resources for people who lose their jobs and can't afford that rent, but also more incentives, upfront for those low income residents, as well as policies that overall just reduce the impacts of climate change on all levels, city, state, and national. And then I guess more of an internal change that people can adopt is using education and empathy as tools to dispel any misconceptions about both climate change and people who are unhoused. If you ever have the time to really dive into these issues and how they're connected, it's really important to share that with the people that because not everyone has the time, but if you do, it can make a really big difference to talk about why you care about that.
Yeah, those are all amazing points. And just to add to it, I think I mentioned earlier the inclusionary housing ordinance. So things like that are really important pieces of policy to really advocate for. And that particular inclusionary housing ordinance got implemented in 2020, I believe. And so it's a 5-year program. And so we need to make, keep track of that. And so at the end of those 5 years, what's the next step in ensuring that the renters still maintain their protections and that they don't just get, completely blindsided when a policy like that ends. Another thing to consider is advocating for climate action plans. And this is something that Climate Action Campaign is really connected with. And actually Nicole Capritz, who's the founder of CAC, Climate Action Campaign, she is an amazing woman who has really made huge changes and waves in the city. And she really advocated for San Diego to adopt the very first climate action plan. And that was adopted in 2015, and it actually inspired other cities to then adopt their own climate action plans. And so it's amazing to see how one event like that can really be replicated and have those ripple effects purely from inspiration, because other cities will see, hey, they're doing that. What are we doing? We should do something too. And then part of what our organization does is watch these policies as time goes on and see how they're being implemented. And when they're not being implemented well or fast enough, then we call them out on it. And so we're always doing things like public comments or holding press conferences and advocating for true implementation of these plans and ensuring that the policymakers are doing what they say they're going to do. So, because often what we see is policymakers or cities or things like that will commit to something, and then 5 years, 10 years, 15 years down the line, there's only been like a 1% change in decrease in carbon emissions or something like that, and it's like, that's not good enough. So we have to be consistently holding our policymakers accountable for the things that they say they're going to do. and then ensuring that the legislation is created. So if we're seeing gaps in legislation, then we can work with the local city officials to create that legislation to ensure that that these, like the unhoused populations, are not forgotten about. And some of the, the most effective way that we can connect with the homeless populations is to provide housing for them. And so, yeah, affordable housing is the solution to homelessness in so many ways. And so by advocating for protections on tenant evictions, for example, and then, yeah, advocating for more implementation of affordable housing, that is quite honestly one of the most effective things that we could do on the policy side of things. As far as for concerned citizens, again, showing up through collective action, and the more that we come together and all come to the table and advocate for these sorts of things, whether that's through voting in, maybe it's on a ballot measure, for example, or maybe it's on like even just voting for a policymaker who is going to be supportive of climate action. Or maybe it's coming to a public comment period, for example, and voicing your support or concerns about various policies that are in the talks of getting adopted, or even voicing what legislation needs to be created, those sorts of things. So at any given time, any of us can write a letter to our local policymakers, or we can show up to a council meeting and express our concerns about something in particular, whether or not that's on the agenda that day or not. There's always an opportunity to do that. So yeah, I think to tie it all together, any sort of climate action is critical, because we're at the point where we really have to revolutionize our entire society to change the paradigm from one that is built on extraction of and domination over our planet, and then one that feeds off of inequity to profit the few, and build a society and paradigm that is rooted in resilience and taking care of each other, and actually taking responsibility for each other, for our planet, and to really help ensure that we are building just and holistic and safe and yeah, beautiful societies going forward.
Thank you so much for both of those answers. I feel like they were exactly what I was looking for. And I think Christine's question in the chat, she's asking if there's any literature that discusses the intersection of climate change and homelessness. That's just like a testament to this whole conversation in general. Like, this is what we wanted. We wanted people to be more aware and to make this link and become more curious. So I will definitely look into some more literature. If Karen and Allie, if you guys find anything, link it to me and I'll send it out to our audience. But other than that, I just want to say thank you so much for being here. I am so enlightened, and I feel like there's a fire lit under me to do all these things, share more about both the housing crisis and the climate crisis and how they intertwine with each other. And I think that's all I have to say. Just thank you so much for your time and for all that you've shared with us and your experience. And then I'm just going to hand it over to Martin to close it out.
I was just going to say really quick, thank you for being here, and just thank you for the work that you're doing. Climate change is something that is extremely important to everyone, but more specifically, it's very important to young people, because this is the world we have to live in. And so if you don't get it enough, thank you for the work you do. It's important. And in some ways, I feel like I'm almost like relying on you. But yeah, thank you for being here, and thank you for everyone in the audience for being here. So hope everyone has a wonderful night.
Can I add one more thing, actually? Yeah, as far as resources, and I'll link all this to Erica if you wanted to share it out, but we have an advocacy training workshop coming up. If anyone was interested in joining that, it's an opportunity to learn more about how the process works, how to give effective public comment, what is public comment, etc., all of that. And then also we have since we're working on this regional decarbonization framework, which again is just a fancy way of saying working with the county on their plans to lower emissions throughout the county and climate action in general, there are opportunities to voice concerns and priorities. And so the more that everyone here and your networks and everyone is voicing, we need to be thinking of our homeless populations in this and strategize of how to ensure that they're not left out going forward. The county does look at all of this feedback and they will consider it for future climate plans or things like that. And so it's actually a really great opportunity again for like concerned citizens to get engaged. So I'll send you all that information. There's surveys, there's the dates for the upcoming events and things like that. So yeah, and again, thank you so much for having us. It's been a pleasure to be here.
Yes, please send me that information. Thank you so much, everyone, for your time, and I hope to see you guys at the next forum. Bye, take care.